Our hero is a man of few words. When he crosses paths with an enemy commander, she becomes his prisoner. Immediately, they butt heads, with her trying to murder him and escape. And then, ugh, do I even need to tell you the rest of this setup? They end up together at the end of the story. You probably knew that when I said the commander was a woman. This isn't even about tropes. This is about being predictable. I'm author DC Ferguson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, would you like to work with me? Are you an avid reader? If so, I'd love to have you join DC Ferguson's reading group. Get the Dragon's Dream Saga totally free. All you have to do is leave an honest review on Amazon for me. So if you're able to leave reviews on Amazon and you love to read, fill out the form in the comments below and I'll get you started with Project Phoenix. I love you. The thing is about being predictable is there's only so many ways to tell a story. Yeah, I know. It seems counterintuitive with millions upon millions of books in the world. But it's true. Every story will boil down to its core ancient roots, fitting neatly into categories like drama, morality play, tragedy, comedy, romance, and so on. Don't believe me? Well, watch this video, where I show you how Pet Sematary is a morality play. These days, most horror is a morality play, but that's a lesson for another day. The point is, with only so many ways to tell a story, how are we still enjoying books or movies as a medium at all? How are we not repeating ourselves? How do we avoid this pitfall of knowing everything that happens in our tale before we've told it? Well, to the repeating question, the sad answer is that sometimes we are repeating ourselves. I mean, Sacred Cow or not, I liked Avatar a whole lot better when it was called The Last Samurai. And I liked Last Samurai better when it was called Dances with Wolves. Thing is, if we're exploring the space set out before us by our favorite films and television, our own work is undoubtedly going to filter through those. I'm completely unashamed to say that my first book in the Dragon's Dream Saga, Project Phoenix, was heavily inspired by the feel of the first Mission Impossible movie. I wanted to capture that breakneck pace of action, the fear of constantly being on the run, with this looming antagonist hidden in the shadows and no idea what we're running from. But I also told my own story. It's one that's set in a world far into our future. So, where is the line drawn? When have we gone too far into familiar territory that our audience knows everything that happens next? One of the first problems, as I touched on in the intro, is tropes. These little buggers encapsulate a path that we walk that so many others have done before that the audience knows exactly where we're going. For that sake, watch this video on cliché and tropes. Understand the difference and know that having classic tropes in your story, such as a chosen one or a swashbuckling pirate with a heart of gold, is perfectly okay, even if it is a bit played. The problem that we're discussing today is a little bit more intangible than just tropes. It's beats and scenes, it's the feel and pacing, it's the interactions between characters. So much of it can be so predictable if you're borrowing direction or inspiration from other films and books. We could use the word formula, but I feel even that word kind of oversimplifies the problem. So let's dig deeper. Foreshadowing is a tricky business. You're setting up an event or a turn in the story and you want it to feel like it was always there, right in front of the reader. But sometimes they look at the Chekhov's gun on the mantle and they immediately say, oh, this mysterious side character is going to use that when they turn on the hero. See, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why would we ever use foreshadowing? Well, foreshadowing is a technique to make sense of an event or a twist that happens later in the story. That's it. It's just a hint. We don't want our story to take a huge left turn when our audience didn't even know there was a road there. We want them to see it and say, oh, it was right there the whole time and I didn't even realize. But, as you can imagine, giving up too much information allows them to figure it out long before the twist comes. Since I don't know your story specifically, I can only guide you with trite phrases like less is more, or the cooking phrase, you can always add, but you can't take away. Those both hold true, but I'm going to bring you another concept that may be altogether new for you to hear. Sometimes a great revelation isn't in the what, it's in the how. Your audience can know what's coming, but make it so they don't know how. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In the Dragon's Dream Saga, there's a prophecy our hero is shown in Book 2, Heaven's Crest. It literally depicts the final conflict of the series that happens in Book 8. I didn't shy away from it. It's literally the cover of the Dragon's Dream. This is what my hero saw. Herself bathed in magic, flanked by 3 ravens, as she burst into the antagonist's office for a final battle. I told the audience exactly what's going to happen at the end of the series, in my second book, but I never told them how. Books 3 through 7 all stand on their own as stories, with each of them lending a piece to the puzzle. But when I hit book 8, even if you know what's coming, I'd like to say it's surprising how we get there. And that brings us to our first deep cut, the 1995 action movie The Replacement Killers. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this is my favorite action movie of all time. Like, number one with a bullet. Pun most certainly intended. The reason I enjoy this movie so much is because it shatters so many expectations. First of all, the film is called The Replacement Killers, but it's not even referring to the stars on the poster. We have Chow Yun-fat as Sonny, a hitman by virtue of indentured servitude to a crime boss in China. When he's asked to pull the trigger on a cop's child, he can't. That means two things. One, he's a dead man. Even if he runs, his family back home in China is not safe. And two, replacement killers will be dispatched to do the job anyway, so that kid is also as good as dead. At first, our main character's first concern is to get back to his family in China. In trying to do so, he makes an accomplice at Amira Sorvino, a document forger. Now, the two of them have to fight for their lives on the run. Here's the thing about this film that makes it my favorite, though. It breaks tropes so much it'll make your head spin. He's a man and she's a woman. There is no romantic subplot between them whatsoever. He's a badass hitman with a gun. She is not his sidekick. She is fearless and dangerous. They're on the run, but their own lives aren't what they're trying to save. Their main motivation is to save the kid from the replacement killers and to get Sonny back to China to save his family. In addition to being incredibly stylish and having some great action, the story it is telling is leading us down a path where the only way for our heroes to survive is to pile more burdens on their back. It's not enough for them to run and hide and save their own skin. They have to run into the lion's den and pull everyone else out of it too. Our hitman, Sonny, his hands aren't clean, but he's not an anti-hero. If you want to see what I mean when I say how we get there is more important than knowing how it ends, watch this film. It basically takes the concept of predictability and laughs in its face. Part of the trick that it's using is that it knows the story it wants to tell. In that sense, it's not beholden to any tropes of the action genre, such as the romantic subplot, useless sidekicks, or genius children. As far as action goes, those are the three things that always bog a story down, and they are the worst tropes in the genre as far as I'm concerned. So, the lesson here is that when we're foreshadowing, knowing the story you're trying to tell should clue you in as to whether you're giving away all your secrets. Be subtle. And even if you let your audience know what is happening, don't ever tell them how. Bring the surprises. Now that question is how, and the answer, well, that's our next topic. If you're familiar with this episode of Tropes and Cliches, or just familiar with the concept in general, then you'll know tropes are not harmful of themselves. There's a reason that they're sometimes beaten to death, and that's because they work. We like retelling our favorite tales with new characters, or a twist we weren't expecting. Sometimes we can forgive an entire retread of a story that we've seen dozens of times because it strikes that chord in us that connects us with our ancient bros. But in the foreshadowing category, it's very difficult to pull off foreshadowing when your tale is relying on these tropes, because we already know what the next beat of the story is. And so your foreshadowing gives us the how. You see how that works? When you give away the what and the how, you get predictability. So, how do we circumvent that and bring refreshing surprises that keep our audiences hooked? Well, this would be a technique called subverting tropes. What that means is that you're actually using the introductory beats of a trope to lull the audience into thinking that they know what will happen next. But thanks to your incredible wit, you take a sharp left turn away from the trope, and now the reader has no idea what's happening next. We see this exemplified in films like Scream. This was actually a pretty meta subversion, to be honest. While Neve Campbell and Courtney Cox are pretty well-known actresses, Drew Barrymore was by far the most popular star in this film at the time, and she's prominently featured on the poster. No one expected that she would be eviscerated in the first 5 minutes of the movie, basically a cameo at best. Look at the framing of the first season of Game of Thrones. While there were a dizzying number of characters to remember, there would be no mistaking Sean Bean's Ned Stark was the main character. Even when things looked really grim for our hero, there was always the expectation of an 11th hour save. After all, he's the main character, right? So when the axe fell on Ned, that was not only subverting the trope of the hero can never die, it set the tone for the whole series. Now, since we mentioned Game of Thrones, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the lessons we learned from the final season. Anyone could easily make the argument that the trajectory of the character of Daenerys was always headed for the psycho tyrant her father was. The story laid that foundation very easily. The thing is, in her moment of triumph at King's Landing, she spikes the ball and decided to go nuts, incinerating the city and murdering the same people she wanted to rule over. The only problem was this shift in her personality occurs within 2 episodes. The despair, the shock, the descent into madness that we needed to see to make this transition believable simply wasn't there. So even though our benevolent ruler we were rooting for would have subverted the trope by being worse than anyone before her, the execution was so poor that it would have been better not to have been subverted at all. This is a hard lesson, that not all tropes are bad, and not all subversions are good. If you're subverting a trope for the sake of unpredictability, oftentimes referred to as shock value, it means you didn't properly characterize the subversion, so it feels like it came out of nowhere. Now you know why I cover such a vast array of topics on storytelling on this channel. As we discussed a few weeks back on the effect of theme in storytelling, theme can change tone, and that in turn can change audience expectation, which in our example in that episode can even force us to change genre. The art of storytelling is a lot like a watch. Under the face of it, there are countless intricate moving parts. With anything out of sync, it ripples through the whole device and, well, the timing is off. It stops working correctly. Tropes don't just touch our ability to foreshadow, they make our storyline seem tired, or a retread of tales done better by others, or just utterly predictable. But DC, what does good foreshadowing even look like? Well, guy who talks to your monitor, let's take a look. In our next deep cut, which if I was a teacher would be required watching, the 1960 horror classic Psycho. I literally have watched this film a dozen times or more, and a fair number of times spent on the 1990 remake with Vince Vaughn. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the story and its twist ending, stop this video immediately. Do yourself a huge favor and go watch it. I'll be here waiting. Don't worry. So, with that spoiler alert out of the way, our bad guy is either sad little Norman Bates or his mother. When questioned by a private detective about his mother, though, he says she is, quote, as harmless as one of those stuffed birds. Well, of course she is. She's taxidermied up in the house and has been dead for years. There's a certain element of good foreshadowing that either a character, the narrator, or even you as the author is playing a game of I know what you don't know. Look at Tyler Durden in Fight Club. It's written from the narrator's perspective. Even in the book, it clues you in that the narrator and Tyler are the same person, but only in retrospect. There are details scattered all through the book and the movie that tell you this, but you don't see them. That's good foreshadowing. Innocuous details that you never, ever make a big deal out of. A casual mention buried in a paragraph where it blends right in. A slight turn of phrase that makes sense in the moment, but even more sense later. These are the kinds of things that we're going for. Remember, you can spoil the what, but don't ever spoil the how. Foreshadowing isn't only an advanced technique, it's a balancing act on a tightrope. One slip and you give away to predictability, and no one wants that. Remember, keep the surprises coming. Don't fear the trope, but don't be such a slave to them that your tale is color by numbers. This is one of those things in writing that takes the most gentle touch, and less is always more. Thanks so much for all the donations from you guys as well. This beautiful girl is Liana. She's 12 and on the spectrum. We're working with the Boston-based Needs organization to get this little lady a service dog. If you'd like to help, check out the link in the description down below. Also, don't forget to sign up for my newsletter while you're down there. The link is also in the comments. And you're going to get Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. You get cool news about what I'm working on in books and here on the channel, and it comes loaded with cool authors and promotions for fantasy and sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.